Time for another board game review, and this time we have the game Final Boss the Card Game. This was sent to me by the designers Luis Martinez and Rafael Gonzalez. In Final Boss, players have been swallowed by an evil video game and have to compete against each other to defeat the final boss. Every turn, enemies appear and players will fight them, using their cards to gain an advantage in combat or to sabotage other players. Use your cards wisely and collect as many victory coins as you can, and you may be able to defeat the final boss. Let me show you how to play. So in Final Boss, each game consists of a succession of rounds until a final boss appears. Every round, players will face enemies in order to collect victory coins. Players can collect those coins by either defeating an enemy or by making other players get killed by enemies, which boosts merciless competition. At the end of each round, the player 1 marker will be passed to the next player. Once that marker completes a full circle, meaning it returns to the first player, a final boss will be summoned. To win, players will have to use their hand wisely while increasing their attack and health stats by collecting powerful inventory cards. Using power gems is another key strategy to win, as they can be used any time to draw 3 power-ups. After a final boss fight, the player with the most victory coins wins the game. In case of a draw, the player with the most power gems wins, and if there's still a tie, whoever has the highest attack value. So you give the player 1 marker to the first player, and each player will get 5 power-up cards in their hand. The hand limit is 5 cards. And before starting the first round, players can activate any characters, weapons, and items in their inventory space. So there are different kinds of cards you can play. First up, we have character cards. You can only play 1 character card in your inventory at a time, so if you want to change it, you got to discard the old one first. Like here we have an Ancient Priest. His combat effect is Wololo. Turn combat enemy or another player's character into your character, or discard it. And they also have stats as well. This value here is the attack value, and this value here is the health value. You may also only activate 1 weapon card in your inventory at a time. So here's the Diamond Pickaxe. It has 2 attack, 1 health. Passive effect, Crafty. Draw 1 extra power up for each enemy you kill. And then we have item cards. You may only activate 5 item cards in your inventory at a time. Here's the Horned Helmet, which gives you a passive effect, Dracoborn. Gain +1 attack, +2 health for each power gem you have. And you can play up to 5 different items at a time. Now, passive effects just take place as long as they're in your inventory. Combat effects, these orange effects, will occur when you put them in the combat pile, which I'll explain later. And then instant effects, as soon as you play them, they happen. Like, for example, Pinball. Chaos, shuffle the combat pile to randomly change its order. So let's go over how a round works. In phase 1, you spawn enemies. Player 1 will draw cards from the enemy deck. Depending on the number of players you have, you'll do 3 in a 2-player game, 2 in a 3 to 4 player game, and so on, without looking at the cards, and place them unflipped in the center. So, for a 2-player game, we're going to take 3 enemies and put them face down. These are the dormant enemies and will be assigned later by players. Then we go to phase 2, where we do enemy targeting. Player 1 will assign the first dormant enemy. You can assign the enemy to whoever you want, including yourself. That player will become the combatant later in combat. So let's say player 1 assigns themselves the dormant enemy. Then it's time for inventory activation. You may activate or swap new characters, weapons, and items from your hand onto your inventory in front of you. So like here's the trifecta of power, which gives you 3 attack, also has a passive effect for the villain. If you activate the other 2 trifectas, gain 5 victory coins, discard the trifectas afterwards. Trifecta, get it? So yeah, you add up these items and your character's stats together. Then it's time to flip the enemy card that was assigned. So if player 1 assigned the enemy card to themselves, it's an abomination. Okay, instant effect. Assimilation complete. Combatant has to discard 1 inventory character. Okay, so they would lose their Ancient Priest and lose that stat. Otherwise, we look at their attack value and health value. Attack value is 3, and their health is 4. However, before we start combat, now it's time to go into the combat pile. For each combat, there's a combat pile where any player may play power-up cards with these orange combat effects. So you play cards following a combat cycle, starting from combatant and continuing clockwise until each player has played or passed. You can play cards with combat effects face up on top of the combat pile, either from your hand or inventory. So, for example, let's say player 1 plays Speed Boots. It's fight or flight, strike first, or escape. If you escape, the next player becomes the combatant. Then let's say, I don't know, player 2 does Diffuse Kit. Which is a counter. Cancel 1 card on the combat pile or discard 1 inventory card and place it on top of that. After each player has played a card, the first player can then play one final combat cycle card. So let's say they play this Fury card. It's a Warg. Add or subtract 3, attack 3, health 3 to any side for a combat. So then it's time to resolve the combat pile, top to bottom. So let's say this one goes first. Each combat effect is resolved by the player who played it. So let's say player 1 adds, or let's say they subtract 3 health and attack from the Abomination for their Fury card. Then player 2 will cancel a card on the combat pile. Or they can discard one inventory card. Say it gets rid of their horn helmet. Then we go to Speed Boots, which is a fight or flight situation. You can strike first or escape. If you escape, next player becomes the combatant. So, in this case, player 1 is going to choose to continue to fight instead of escaping. Now it's time to calculate the enemy's attack and health, and your attack and health as the combatant. So this Fury card deducted 3 from both stats, meaning this guy has 0 attack and only 1 health. What happens though, the enemy gets to strike first against the opponent's health value. If the enemy had enough to actually kill the player, then that player discards all their cards, both inventory and hand cards, and the other players collect a victory coin. Then that person draws 5 new power-up cards, and you discard the enemy. However, in this case, the combatant is going to survive because this guy has 0 attack. If we actually calculate it, so it was 1 health, 3 health, plus 5, 6 attack. I mean, no matter what, it's going to, because this guy only had 1 health left, it's going to definitely defeat the Abomination. If the enemy is killed, the combatant collects a drop. That means to draw a power-up card. However, with Diamond Pickaxe, the player gets to draw 2 cards because it's 1 extra. Then that player earns a victory coin, and the enemy is discarded. Once you finish the current combat, then you go back to phase 2, where you assign the other dormant enemies you did not fight. However, the player that assigns that enemy will be the next player clockwise from the player who assigned to the previous enemy, and you keep doing that until each enemy is fought. Once you do that, then the next player will be the new player 1. Everybody draws a power up, and you do the next round. Once everyone has had a turn being the first player, then it's time for the final boss. You can activate any inventory cards you want, and then you reveal the final boss. In this case, it's Elderborn. 20 attack, 25 health. Also, his passive effect, Eternal. Players can play an extra cycle for this combat. Well, it's not going to affect us for this tutorial. Now, the way to resolve this guy is you resolve it like you would any other fight, but instead it's going to attack all players at the same time, each of them considered a side of the combat. And there are 3 combat cycles. Well, in this case, there's 4 because it's eternal. But yeah, you starting with the player with the most victory coins, you start doing your combat cycles again. Final boss will strike each player 1 by turn order. If a player survives the strike of a final boss, they earn 2 victory coins. Not bad. Then each surviving player can strike back, same as with enemies. If you can kill the final boss, you get 3 victory coins. After the final boss, can count victory coins to decide the winner. And like I said, if there's a tie, more power gems. And if there's still a tie, highest attack value. Each player gets a certain number of power gems at the beginning of the game. And there are ways you can earn these as well. Now that's pretty much how you play the game. You just do these combat cycles. Each player places cards in them, and then you trigger them, and you count up your stats and see if you survive. So let me just show you some of the other cards, some examples. Here we have Cirrus Struggle. It's a character. Cirrus Struggle. So, passive effect, level up. Gain +1 attack and +1 health for each victory coin you have. Ankh of Yender. It's an instant effect. Divinity. Cancel your death or collect 1 power gem. Mech Pack. Glutton. Cancel all cards in the combat pile. So if you want to be a dick and be like, you know what? All your cards are neutralized. This is the guy to do it. And that's pretty much it. You just try to play cards to build up your stats and or play cards in the combat piles to try to mess with each other or, you know, strengthen yourself during your fights. And try to collect those coins. And that's pretty much it.
There are some decently interesting card play mechanics going on here, but overall, this game feels very luck-based. You can still get a good feeling of take that, and you know, it's satisfying to pull off a victory, but
oftentimes it just kind of felt like it was mainly because luck was on your side. I'm gonna be honest, the whole 80s video game aesthetic for board games, I'm kinda over. It's fine. I mean, the most it'll get out of me is a little, ha. I mean, you even saw me during the tutorial, like, ha, serious struggle, okay. And not that that's 80s, but you know what I mean. Video game-based games, you know, parodies. You know, they're cute. You know, the presentation in this game isn't necessarily for me, but it's done well. You know, if you like really nerdy video game references, this game is chock full of them. I'm not personally a fan, but maybe, you know, your mileage will vary on that. The whole idea of a combat cycle where every player plays a card to try to, like, mess with the fight is interesting in theory. But the more cards that are added, the more it's just absolutely beyond your control. Even if you have the last turn as the combatant, it's just this sort of unwieldy sandwich of cards that is almost guaranteed to ruin you. Because there's no reason other players are against you, so they're just going to play their worst, you know, meanest cards to try to fuck you up. So basically, you're just going to get stomped unless you're lucky enough to have the right cards. And then the penalty for losing is losing all your cards, not just in your inventory, but in your hand. It is a brutal punishment for something that can easily be totally out of your control. Oh, that player played that card? Oh, I can't beat that. Oh, I lose all my cards. Woof. Speaking of cards, here's another issue I have with the game. It's very fiddly with the numbers and adding it. Like, each card, you gotta add the stats, and some of them are, like, a little too complicated for what's supposed to be kind of like a light game. You find yourself having to add all the stats in your inventory, add all the stats for the monster. Some of those stats are based off other things, like, okay, how many gemstones do I have? Okay, and then you have to take into account every single combat effect that affects the effects. Now, it's all basic math, but it's just annoying enough and bothersome where it kind of becomes a chore, especially as more cards are played. It's one of those instances where I'm like, man, this would be way better as a video game, if I'm being totally honest, because it can instantly calculate those totals for you instead of you having to do it yourself, which is kind of a drag. And since you're going to be switching out characters and weapons and items all the time, your stats are always changing, and enemy cards can affect other enemy stats. It's just so fiddly for what is supposed to be, from my perspective, a very light kind of game. It's a little too unwieldy for what it is. It may seem like I'm really down on this game, but I actually didn't hate playing it. Any card game with mechanics where you can do instant effects, and it's always going to be, like, pretty fun, you know. And, you know, I was engaged throughout the game, but it's too fiddly and too luck-based for my taste. You may like it if you really liked the sort of video game aesthetic and the, you know, in-jokes. You know, if that really appeals to you, that may be like a plus in your book. For me, it wasn't so much, so that couldn't save it for me. I will say I like this much better than, say, like Boss Monster, but I wasn't super captivated by this. Again, a little too fiddly, a little too luck-based for me.